everyone, welcome to Sensory Collective's second installment to our series on Introduction to Sensory Processing. There will be quite a few people who haven't listened to our first installment, so part of today's session we'll be doing a really brief recap of some of the material that we covered in that first session, or you can simply go back onto our YouTube channel and watch that first video in its entirety. But today we'll go through our little agenda. So again, we're going to be doing a bit of a recap on our sensory systems. So that's all of our senses and how they relate to sensory processing. We're also going to be talking about how to best structure your sensory breaks or your sensory interventions. So there's a specific structure that you need to follow to get the maximum results. And we're also going to talk about when to use our sensory interventions across your day and focusing on prevention rather than reaction. So that's our little summary. But first, for all of those who didn't hear our first installment, we will again think about the definition of sensory processing. What does that mean? So basically, sensory processing is how our brains receive, organize, and then respond to all of the sensory information that we get from our environment. So we all function in our world and respond to all the information that we get through all of our senses. And then the sensory processing is actually how our brain receives it, which can be different, how we organize it, and then how we respond instinctively to that information. So again, our 5 senses that we're all taught from school from the very beginning is sight, smell, taste, hearing, and touch. But we also have 3 other senses, and these I call the forgotten 3 because not a lot of people are actually aware of our 3 extra senses. So we'll go through them now. The first one is proprioception. So this is our body awareness. Second one is vestibular. This one is sort of linked to our balance, coordination, and movement. And then finally, interoception, which is the sense that we have that helps us to recognize our internal bodily functions. So how we recognize how we're hungry, thirsty, how we need to go to the bathroom. So we're going to go a lot deeper into those 3 today. And you will also have, if you've come along to any of our sessions, you will have received some handouts or some posters that go into depth about every single sensory sense. So there'll be 8 in the series, and we're going to, if you're watching this in conjunction with the PowerPoint, that there'll be a link below, then you'll also be able to follow along with what we're talking about here, as we'll be linking it to these posters. So to start with, vestibular sensory system. So the vestibular system is actually located in our inner ear, and it helps us with balance, coordination, movement, even spatial orientation. So this one's really important because it allows us to coordinate our posture, even our eye movements, and general muscle tone. So what are the signs that you should be able to see if you or your child are struggling with the vestibular sense? We'll go through, this is not a comprehensive list by any means, but here are a lot of the common ones that you will see if there's an issue with your vestibular sensory processing sense. So the first one is obviously difficulty with balance and coordination. We can't coordinate both sides of our body at the same time. It's difficult to copy those coordinated movements. Fear of movement is also a big one. So fear of swings, escalators, issues with getting in the car and like moving in the car. Or on the other side of the spectrum, it's seeking that excessive movement. So when we're talking about difficulties with regulating our sensory systems, we can either be too much or fear it. So we can be processing it poorly on either side of the spectrum. So for vestibular, it's fear of movement or seeking excessive movement. Trouble with like spatial awareness or navigation, our left and rights can be tricky. motion sickness or excessive dizziness, or again on the flip side, having being able to spin and spin and spin and never feeling dizzy. So not registering that spinning is another sign. Poor muscle tone and posture, as well as craving or avoiding spinning. So you'll see lots and lots of spinning behaviors, or again, not liking our feet to be off the ground or not liking that sensation of spinning. So there are some pretty common signs of vestibular processing challenges and things that we can do. So somewhere to start is start experimenting with these different strategies. So hanging upside down, doing more balancing, even yoga can be really helpful. Swinging is a really big one, and spinning, say on like an office chair, if you've got that at home, can start doing some more of that spinning. When we're thinking about swinging, you can have it in, you can do different things if you have it like linear, so just back and forth, versus across all planes, so like angular, so we're doing some of this, or just a circular spinning and swinging kind of motion. They can all feed different parts of our sensory vestibular system. Things like rolling, tumbling, cartwheels, merry-go-rounds, these are all different strategies that we would use to get more of that vestibular sensory information into our bodies. So that's the vestibular sense. The next one, proprioception. So, definition. Our proprioceptive system is comprised of receptors that are located in all of our muscles, joints, and tendons. And so it's activated when we're putting force through those receptors. And then they tell our brain where our body is in space. So proprioception tells our bodies how to grade force, how to grade movement, and how to grade like positioning of your body. So a good example to explain proprioception is being able to tell where your body is in space without using your other senses. So for example, if you close your eyes and someone positions one arm in a certain configuration, you'd be able to sense where that arm is and then replicate it. Or another one is our ability to walk upstairs without looking at the stairs and without our feet actually touching the stairs, we can sense where our body is in relation to those stairs and we can walk up them quite instinctively. That's all signs of a balanced proprioceptive system. And so signs of some challenges with our proprioceptive system is clumsiness, so bumping into doorways, tables, frequently falling over, because if you can imagine, if you're not sure where your body is exactly in space, you're going to be missing doorways or tripping over things. Difficulty with fine motor is a really big one with our proprioceptive sense. So things like buttons, zippers, opening packages, tying up shoelaces, those sorts of things are a really common sign. And again, it's because the brain is not able to manage exactly where your fingers are in space in relation to other objects. So that can be a telltale sign of proprioception challenges. Craving being close to someone or constantly being on top of someone. Because again, if we're close to someone, we're being squished, we can tell where our body is in space because it's being pushed off something else. So there's like force going through those muscles and joints. And so craving that sensation of being compressed, whether it's within a beanbag, whether it's in bed, whether it's under like heavy blankets or heavy toy, or again, up against people is a really big sign. Seeking or avoiding, again, those two sides of the spectrum, heavy work. So when we say heavy work, we're talking about lifting, pushing, pulling, climbing, jumping. Again, we think about anything that's putting force through our joints or through our body. Trouble maintaining posture is another one. So if your kid's constantly slouching or always leaning on their hands, leaning on tables or walls, don't want to sit upright or stand upright, that can be a sign that they're proprioceptive sense, because again, they're seeking that awareness of where their body ends and where an object begins. Loving deep hugs or deep pressure is a really big one. A really interesting one is the inability to grade force. So we're slamming doors, or we're not putting enough force in to get them to close, or when we're throwing, we don't know how to throw far or how to throw close because we're not sure of how to grade that force is another sign of sensory processing challenges. And there's lots of other ones, but they're a pretty decent list of some common ones that we often see. And then again, what are some of the strategies or some of the activities that we can use to give our bodies more proprioceptive input? We'll talk about. So again, like we mentioned, heavy work, whatever we're lifting, pulling, pushing. So it can be having an extra heavy backpack to go to school, or having to carry the heavy dinner plates to the table, or having a jungle gym in your backyard. There's lots of climbing, pushing, pulling. Crawling through tunnels, jumping, crashing onto things. Again, yoga, if your kids are interested in that. Any kind of running. Balancing while moving is a good one. Some interesting ones when it comes to proprioception is deep pressure. So lots of deep massage or really deep squeezes. Joint compressions is a really good one, but you have to be taught how to do that because that can be a little bit risky if you get it wrong. Another really good one is vibration. So using like vibration massages that can really give that proprioceptive input. Throwing, catching, all of those different things. Anything that's kind of like exercise related, so push-ups or like pushing your hands in together, squeezing, pulling, those sorts of activities are a great place to start and experiment with. That's your proprioceptive ones. And again, there's lots of overlaps between all our senses, but these are really good examples of proprioception. And then finally, interoception. So like I mentioned before, the definition of interoception is your body's ability to sense and then interpret all that internal stimuli. So being able to recognize if you're hungry, thirsty, if you're in pain, and like what part of the body, or even what category of pain. Is it sharp? Is it achy? All those sorts of things. That's your interoception at work. Even being able to judge your temperature. Are you hot or cold? Your heartbeat, heart rate. And a big one is your ability to understand when you're going to the toilet or when you're full. So if you're full. So if you have issues with those things, or if your child does, that could be your interoception not processing effectively. So what are some signs? Again, like we mentioned, difficulty recognizing hunger, so forgetting to eat, or the same for thirsty, getting dehydrated, or constantly drinking too much water, which is very dangerous. Being able to recognize if you're full, so constantly overeating again without having that sensation of needing to stop, or again, never experiencing the need to start. Being able to, or not being able to understand if we're hot or cold. So it might be a really hot day outside, but your kid's still in tracksuits. That kind of thing can be an interoception problem. Not needing or not being able to recognize when they need to go to the bathroom. So that could be that really, really urgent state. So they have no sensation of it building up, and then it's just immediately it's happening and I have to go right now. That's a sign. And even being able to identify like physical discomfort and pain. Again, interoception processing challenge. So what we can do to help interoceptive challenges is a lot about predictability and routine, using visual schedules to structure in all those necessary activities throughout the day. So when to eat, when to go to the bathroom, how to recognize pain and temperature. So a lot of it's sort of these taught behaviors. So body check-ins with like guided questions to try and link better the body and the mind. Lots of schedules and visual supports to help understand, and body scans. to identify if they've been hurt, anything like that, and using like visual cues and other senses rather than relying on that interoception sense. So that's quite a rare one. We don't see that as often, but it is definitely often misdiagnosed as other medical issues when really it's just an inability to sense those things. So good to be aware and keep an eye out. So we also spoke about in our first session the differences between sensory preferences. So what a neurotypical brain looks like when we're doing our sensory processing versus what's a sensory processing challenge or a need. And basically, in a little nutshell, if you want more information, please go back and listen to the other video on this channel. But if you want it in a nutshell, basically every single brain is a little bit different. So we will all be receiving that sensory information in a different way, organizing it again differently, and then our instinctive responses will be different. And these are our preferences. So this is just how we experience our sensory environment with a neurotypical brain. And like, for example, what one person will find sort of uncomfortable in a sensory way might be different for the next person. So for example, some people have like a very visceral reaction to like nails on a chalkboard, that like noise, or certain textures like skin of a peach. Just having those preferences is just different for every brain. You'll be able to tolerate different levels of noise before you start to get distracted. Things that help you concentrate will be different. For example, some people need absolute silence to be able to focus. Some people need background noise, and that's just a sensory preference. So it's different for every person. But what a neurotypical brain does is automatically, instinctively filter out unnecessary sensory information to keep you regulated or to keep you being able to focus. So a great example is a ticking clock, or if your house is on a busy road that you're really used to, or even like background noises like fans or refrigerator noise. All of that stuff you will often find you'll instinctively tune out if you're needing to focus. And you don't even notice that it's there until someone else points it out, and then it feels like the most obvious thing in the world. But that's your brain instinctively regulating. And you'll also find that you will start to feel that sense of being overstimulated if there's too much noise, if there's too much bright light, whatever your brain is receiving and disliking and finding uncomfortable, you'll naturally be moved to turn things down, turn things off, make sure you switch off your exhaust fan when you're cooking. That sense of relief that you feel after that noise is gone, we instinctively move to regulate ourselves. What neurodivergent brains don't have is that instinctive process. So they will feel that sense of overstimulation, but just sit in it and not be able to do anything about it. Nothing is filtered out instinctively. So whatever is in their environment is being received constantly. And so what we need to do is help those neurodivergent brains by learning different strategies or inputting more input, whatever their brain is seeking or needing, factoring that into their daily routine so it's happening automatically or it's happening as part of a routine, because they're not going to be automatically regulating themselves. Now, regulation. We hear a lot about this word when we're talking about sensory processing things. So quickly being able to understand what is regulation and why do we say it so often. You might hear terms like dysregulation, having a regulated brain or a regulated sensory system or nervous system. What it means is basically our bodies need to be in this just right, equilibrium, balanced state with our nervous system, or how much we're getting of that sensory information from our environment. We need it to be in this just right zone. So we don't want to be too little, because then we're not alert enough. But we also don't want it to be too much, because then we're not calm enough. So it needs to be this just right state of arousal so that we can concentrate, we can learn, we can activate our brains and use our cognitive system And so if you can be overstimulated, so you can be too high, you can be understimulated. And if you're over or under, we call that dysregulation in general. And we want to get back to regulated. So what's so important about being regulated or having our sensory needs addressed first before anything else is because if we're dysregulated and our sensory systems are not balanced, then this disrupts our daily life. It can interrupt how we're managing our emotions. It stops us from being able to cognitively process things, so we can't learn, we can't develop new skills, we can't socialize effectively. So if we're dysregulated, we have no control over a lot of that executive functioning, and so it disrupts our everyday life. So I like to think about sensory processing in general as a foundation, say a foundation of a house. And the walls of our house are our skills, our ability to manage our emotions, ability to socialize. So all of those things make up our roofs and our walls. But if our sensory processing is not first addressed and first firm and a good solid foundation, it's almost as if we're building our house on water, because it can be constantly fluctuating within an hour. You can be through you can be over, under on an hourly basis. And so strategies that you might have used to help, learn a new skill, we're learning maths, or manage a challenging behavior. One day these strategies might be super effective, everything's working, we're fantastic, we're obeying all the rules, following all the directions, excellent. Then the very next day you use the exact same strategy at the exact same time and it does not work, everything's falling down because one day your foundation, the tide's high, and one day the tide's low. And so things will crumble and not work from one day to the other. So we have to always make sure that our brain is regulated, that our foundation is firm every day before we start to build on or use strategies or learn anything or do something challenging, for example. So if our sensory needs are not met and not understood and not regulated, then it's usually a bit of a waste of time to try and do any other kind of therapies or any other kind of schooling or learning because it's going to be very different from one moment to the next. So that's why being regulated and having our sensory processing needs understood and managed is incredibly, incredibly important, and why I'm so passionate about it. So how do we get our foundation firm? You might be asking then. I understand that it's important, but what do we do? How do we start? And first, we have to understand what our sensory needs or our children's sensory needs are, because it's not a one-size-fits-all solution. When our brains are neurodivergent and they're having difficulties with these different sensory processing chains, there's actually 4 different flavors or 4 different categories that your brain falls into. It's either that you're receiving too much or receiving too little. And then you can also be an active responder or a passive responder. So one quadrant will be receives too much, does nothing, or receives too much, does something. Receives too little, does nothing, receives too little, does something. So there's these 4 categories that our neurodivergent brains will instinctively do. And you can be in a different category for every single one of your 8 senses. So you might find that one of your kid might be super seeking movement. So they're just always on the go, actively on the go, but then they avoid certain textures. So again, 2 different presentations for different senses. And so when we try and use the same approach or the same solution for every brain, it's not going to be effective, or you might be killing yourself doing this one strategy or using this one particular intervention and seeing no results. So first, it's understanding what your sensory needs are and then incorporating that into their daily routine or your daily routine. And that's using it, having different sensory breaks, having different sensory moments throughout the day, having it really reliable, really predictable. That's where we start. And so if you're wanting to understand better what your sensory needs are, you can do a sensory assessment, which is a formal occupational therapy tool that exists. So you can really nut out exactly where you or your kid will sit in terms of those categories for every sense, and that will help you focus on what strategies you're going to be putting into these sensory breaks. Now, when we're doing sensory breaks, we have to follow a specific structure. Look, if you take your kids to a playground and they're jumping on a trampoline for half an hour, or they're using swings, or they're running, they're jumping, all of those fantastic sensory input, or playing with different sensory tactile toys, or sensory play, whatever it might be, it's going to be beneficial for their brains. However, it may not be enough. So they might be constantly doing this stuff, so they're receiving, but their brain is not organizing that information in a way that's going to be beneficial. We know there's evidence that tells us that if we have concentrated and structured sensory play, then you will get regulation for 2 to 4 hours from just as much as, say, 15 minutes. But only if it follows this particular structure. So we start with alerting, organizing, and then calming. So that is the structure that we want to adopt into all of our sensory activities, into all of our sensory breaks. We want alerting, organizing, calming. So let me explain those three. So when we talk about alerting, we want big, concentrated, high intensity sensory input. So if we're seeking movement, we want big movements. We want lots of it. We want as much gross motor as possible. If we're seeking tactile, we want lots of different textures. We want lots of like high intensity stuff that we need to be alerting, right? But when we're doing all of that alerting activity, we need to at the very same time make it organized. So if it's organized, your brain is actually receiving that information in a different way and organizing it in the brain in a way that's it's almost like 4 to 5 times more effective. And the way that we make it organized is by using these different things. So it is using things like rhythm, using structure, using purpose, using a start and an end, or having like a cognitive challenge included. So a lot of the all of the activities that we do in our sensory workshops as part of that exploration will have that structure. So you'll be on a swing, but at the same time you have to be throwing a beanbag into a bucket, because that gives it a purpose, it gives it structure. You're not just spinning, but you're also activating your brain, and so it's more organized. And then there's a distinct start and a distinct end, because then you run out of beanbags. If you're rolling on a scooter board, you also have to be pulling yourself along on a rope. So not only does it give you extra proprioceptive input, but again, there's a clear start and a clear end. So you're having to start at a certain point, and then you finish at the other point, and then you could do it again and again. You could do it 5 times. So using counting is also a really great strategy. So instead of jumping on a trampoline, constantly, you can say jump 10 times and then do a high five, or jump 10 times and then have to do star jumps. So changing up a bit, but it means that their brains are being included in the activity and they have to keep count as they go. Another one is using music or using rhythm. So a really fantastic example that I often share that incorporates lots of these different strategies or different ideas to make it organized is using the nursery of 5 little monkeys jumping on the bed. Because we're jumping to a rhythm as we sing the song. We're starting with 5, then we go 4, then we go 3. So there's that counting element. It's a very clear start and a very clear stop. So we know when the song begins and when the song ends. And then as part of that jumping, when they fall off and crash and hit their head, no more monkeys jumping on the bed, then that part is a crash. So they're waiting in anticipation and they have to use timing to get the right point where they jump. So that is a fantastic example of making alerting sensory activities organized. And then finally, always ending with something calm. So when we talk about calming, we're using things like our breathing, our mindfulness, slow and rhythmic rocking, or deep pressure, anything that's a quiet activity that even, again, like uses the brain. So being able to sit and color or listen to really slow calming music, doing some yoga poses that are relaxation based. All of these things will help that nervous system settle and be calm, because we're going alerting in an organized way, and then we need to bring it back down and make sure that we're not being overstimulated, because that definitely exists when we interact with a lot of sensory stuff that's feeding our systems. It can go too high, and so we need to make sure that we're, you know, working on that just right state of being alert but calm and like dropping off. So we want that kind of state of arousal, and that way our brains stay regulated and organized, and then they're also ready to listen to instructions. So calming is a really important part of that sensory structure. So please remember, alerting, organizing, calming, super important, and gives you much better results. Now, we also want to be talking about when in the day we want to be using this sensory structure and doing these sensory activities or having these sensory breaks. We spoke about in our last session, using it before a transition is a really smart time to make sure our brains are regulated before we have to move, because that can be a very challenging time for our neurodivergent brains. Using sensory strategies before we have to learn something new. So making sure that we're regulated before we have to then use our academic brains, or even before we have to do something challenging, or if all our social skills are tricky, being able to be regulated before we have to then socialize or do something that we don't like to do. They're really good times of the day. But the biggest thing, the biggest takeaway that we always have to remember is that we want our sensory breaks and our bodies to receive the sensory information that we need in a very regular and reliable, predictable manner. We need it to be preventative, because once the brain is melting down, once we're overstimulated, dysregulated, and we're seeing these huge behaviors, those brains are actually now, they've switched over from anything rational. The rational brain is offline, and that brain is now in fight, flight, or freeze. So it sort of really just totally bypasses their other part of their nervous system, and that's where those brains are sitting. So there's no ability to negotiate, there's no, you know, reasoning. That part of the brain is completely offline. And so what we have to do when we're faced with a meltdown or any of those big challenging behaviors that I'm sure we've seen is we have to wait. We have to just give space, shepherd them into a safe area to make sure that we're not hurting ourselves or anyone else, and then waiting for that internal self-regulation to take over. And it can take a long time, because remember, these brains don't do that automatically. So we have to wait for that sense to calm, and then we start to offer choices or sensory strategies. But if we're trying to offer someone that's in full meltdown a deep pressure hug or a fidget toy, or hey, let's do some jumping, it's pointless. You're going to get nowhere, and it's probably going to escalate the situation further, because rational brain gone. And so we're dealing with that fight, flight, or freeze. It's like crisis mode. So the way that we prevent meltdowns, or how we manage those, is to make sure we're regulated far before. So keeping a diary of when these meltdowns happen is a really good idea, because then you can preempt them and know when you are going to be needing a regulated brain, because regulated brains do not melt down. They don't melt down. And so if we're using it as a preventative tool and factoring these sensory breaks regularly into different parts of our day, and we have to address this on a daily schedule, then that way we're preempting these meltdowns. We know when's a tricky time, and we're able to stop it before it occurs. You might be able to sense when a meltdown's coming if you're really familiar with that child or yourself, and you're really in tune. You might be able to sense when you're starting to get too dysregulated and overstimulated, and then you're on the way towards that crisis, fight, flight, or freeze mode. But for a lot of brains, a lot of neurodivergent brains, it's a flip of a switch. So there's not usually a lot of warning sign. So that's why we need to make sure that our sensory processing breaks and intervention and strategies are used in a preventative manner rather than reacting, rather than waiting to see the behaviors and then responding. We need to make sure it's part of the daily routine. And that's why a lot of the time you might hear or read in books that it's called a sensory diet, because it has to be the same time, like breakfast, lunch, dinner, you're eating on a regular basis. You need to be feeding your sensory systems on a regular basis. I don't love to use that because it gets a bit confusing because it's not really about food. So yeah, that's our big top tips. So where to start from today, like final tips and takeaways, just to do a quick brief overview, is keep a journal. If you're keeping a journal of your or your children's sensory needs or sensory behaviors, again, go back and look at those different signs, things that you can start to be looking out for and writing it down. Taking note of when in the day we feel like is more challenging or we're more dysregulated than other times of the day. Start to pay attention and write it all down. That way you can start seeing different patterns. Including regular sensory moments into your day. So again, 15 minutes of that concentrated, structured sensory input can last up to between 2 and 4 hours of regulation. And then factoring in another moment, another 15 minutes. Being able to tag it, like habit stack is what I like to say. So be doing these sensory breaks alongside other things that are just part of your routine. So whether it be that you factor in 15 minutes of your morning routine where you can be doing some sensory activities, or while you're brushing your teeth, while you're putting your shoes on, while you're getting ready to get set up at the table, whatever it might be, before bedtime. Coupling it with other things that are just part of your normal routine so you remember. Again, anytime we're doing anything sensory, we want it to be alerting, organizing, and then calming. So wrap it up like a nice little present. And finally, sensory assessments, they do exist. So if you are already linked in with an OT, please ask them if they can do a sensory assessment with you. And that way you'll be able to identify exactly what strategies, what you need to be focusing on, and what your child needs more of or needs less of for all of their senses. If you have been engaged with us, we're also, as the Sensory Collective, offering some sensory assessment packages. So we are NDIS registered, so you can use your plan if that's something that is interesting to you. We'll be doing it as of June 2025. So it will be for a limited amount of time. So please, if you're interested, do get in touch via our email, any of our social media, or you can come and talk to us at our workshops. So please feel free. That is another service that we're going to be offering as a Sensory Collective. So we will be having another sensory workshop with another installment of a little bit more. We're going to dive a bit deeper again into our sensory processing strategies and ways to help and just hopefully bring more understanding. Hopefully you found something useful from this today. Bye now.